Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone, the alternate history podcast. It's Dylan in the host chair today. And with me, I have a very distinguished gentleman. Would you care to say hello?
Hi, good people.
So we have Chris Coppola in the house, everybody. So today we are going to unashamedly steal, we've mentioned Behind the Bastards, one of our favorite podcasts, Robert Evans. If you by chance happen to listen to this podcast, please come on our show. We will have the greatest 4-hour Dan Carlin-esque ramble through history if you want to join us. This is an episode that's directly inspired by an episode of Behind the Bastards because both Chris and I were listening to this series, and I highly recommend it. But to introduce exactly what this is about, I'm going to throw it over to Chris because he's got a story to share.
So I was walking around listening to the Behind the Bastards. I believe it was the first episode. I think Robert Evans, don't worry, we also love story arcs. He does 4 or 5 episode story arcs. Listening to the episode, the story arc on Nicolae Ceaușescu, walking around the mall, walking to get somebody a gift, and one of the salespeople comes up and is like, "Oh, so you didn't hear me talking?" I'm like, "No, sorry, I had my Bluetooth in," and the lady at the store was like, "Oh, what were you listening to?" And I was like, "Oh, I was this podcast on Nicolae Ceaușescu," and she's like, "Oh, really?" Feigning interest, and I'm like, I looked at her and I was like, "Listen, I know you don't know who Nicolae Ceaușescu is. I barely know who Nicolae Ceaușescu is, and not only that, I was in a Lush getting a gift for somebody, and I was like, I don't think the kind of people, no offense to our listeners out there, no offense to Dylan, the people who listen to 5-hour podcasts about Nicolae Ceaușescu don't go buy gifts for people in Lush, whatever." But so yeah, today's episode is about the basically Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceaușescu. Take it away, Dylan.
Yeah, and it's actually kind of funny because Chris and I both happen to have the same kind of idea for how this would be a good episode. Chris was in Lush. I was doing domestic husband things and mowing my lawn at 9 a.m. on a Sunday when Robert Evans talks about the exact point in this fork we're going to use as a divergence. And that is, so a little bit of background on Nicolae Ceaușescu. He, after World War II, became in 1964-65 the dictator of Romania. He was kind of an iconoclast, not in the Joseph Tito mold, but kind of in that sense, in that he was a communist dictator, but he didn't toe the Warsaw Pact Communist Party line. He kind of did his own thing.
And he was actually really uniquely successful in being able to do his own thing while at the same time not.
Yeah, unlike Tito, he stayed in the good graces of the Soviet Union to a certain extent. They didn't try to assassinate him constantly.
Or overthrow him or bring him any of these things.
But really, this all boils down to the fact that, Ceaușescu was born into a Romanian kind of peasant, farmer, rural family. And they moved to Bucharest when he was, I think, 11 or 10, something like that. He's a kid. And when you're a farmer and you move to the city, especially in the 1920s and early 30s, this is a time when, this is the beginning of industrialization, mass industrialization for a lot of countries. So you're a farmer, you have kids, and you move to the city where you can't farm anymore. Well, you've got to make money. So you kind of send the kids out to sort of learn a trade so that they can help out, be productive. And Ceaușescu apprentices with a shoemaker. And the shoemaker just so happens to be a member of the illegal, at that point, Communist Party of Romania. There's some weird stuff that goes on where Romania doesn't officially have a communist party. They have like some socialist labor peasants parties, but the Communist Party is there. It's just kind of illegal and it's underground and it's in all these other parties. But this shoemaker, this cobbler, he's a member of this illicit Communist Party. And so Ceaușescu kind of takes some of his political ideology from this cobbler. And more importantly, Ceaușescu, kind of a weird kid, like kind of awkward, kind of socially on the outside. And there's Robert Evans talks about this, which is kind of what got us into this fork. And Ceaușescu kind of hears rumors from some of the kids at school, because, you know, he's 11, he's got to go to school, that the Communist Party is where all the hot girls go to, and it's where he can make friends. So Ceaușescu, socially awkward kid, 11 years old, strange city, he's like, I want to go where I can make friends and meet pretty girls. And so that's kind of how Ceaușescu starts in the Communist Party, which, to fast forward a little bit and then to come back, when the Soviets invade, quote unquote, liberate Romania after World War II, and they set up the sort of coalition, quote unquote, democratic government, the Communist Party of Romania has 700 members in like 45 or 46.
By the way, that 700 number, we've actually quoted it before, because I had just listened to these episodes when we did the episodes on kind of the Commonwealth invading the Balkans. That's why I had that number handily available.
Yeah.
I'm good. I'm not that good.
Yeah. So at this point, the Communist Party is tiny. And Ceaușescu just so happens to join the super tiny party that ends up, after World War II, taking over the entire government. So that's how Ceaușescu gets in good.
One thing that's kind of important to say is, in World War II, Romania was not invaded by the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
Romania joined the Germans because they were worried about the Soviets. So what wound up happening is a little bit like what happens in Germany and in kind of Vichy France. One of the reasons de Gaulle, and the throwback to our other episode, maybe Girard, is so important is because when the Soviets come in, everybody that has been in political office is now tainted as a fascist, because they were part of the regime that actually joined Nazi Germany in Operation Barbarossa. So I think it kind of comes in and takes out the entire political elite as compromised collaborators with Nazi Germany.
Yeah. So the gist of the fork is Ceaușescu apprentices with a different cobbler, is the long and the short of it. And what that does is, or he doesn't hear about the rumors of the communists having all the pretty girls. So basically, Ceaușescu joins one of the other, dozen political parties that are in Romania, whether it's, the National Peasants Party, maybe he goes full Iron Guard or something.
Remember, the Peasants Party was kind of the lefter legal party, and it was infiltrated by members of the Communist Party, but he very well could have just joined the Peasants Party himself
exactly.
as a member of the party and not as a infiltrationist communist element within it.
Yeah, exactly. So at the end of the day, what this does is this means that Ceaușescu is not a communist in the aftermath of World War II, when the Soviets basically threw a nominally democratic socialist labor peasants party government kind of forced through and ramrod George. And disclaimer for the rest of the episode, neither of us speak Romanian. We are going to butcher a lot of Romanian names in this episode, so we apologize. I know it's a Romance language. I speak English and enough Italian to get by in an Italian restaurant. That's it. So don't expect too much of us in this episode.
I will kick you out of this meeting if you mean the Olive Garden.
No. I mean actual Italian restaurants. Anyway. So we're going to say that Ceaușescu doesn't join the Communist Party. And what that means is he is functionally out of the apparatus of government when George Day, who is the communist kind of initial general secretary, dictator, party leader, formally kind of sets up Romania as a member of the Warsaw Pact and the Eastern Bloc in the aftermath of World War II. Now, kind of like our Lyndon Johnson episodes, this is going to be one of those things where we set something up and then nothing really happens for a while, because nothing really happens differently if Ceaușescu isn't in the Communist Party until 1964-65.
Let's pause for a second, just because, half the time we do this for non-American, we have to do this for all of our listeners. Let's go ahead and make sure and lay out and establish, like, what is our timeline of what did, like, why does this matter, and what does he do? Because, folks, this is a deep cut, and we acknowledge that.
Yeah. So 64-65 is kind of the main functional point of divergence, because George Day dies, and then in the aftermath, kind of your classic Soviet political power struggle, there's the members of the Politburo. People have to figure out who's going to be basically the next.
By the way, cannot recommend this enough. Robert Evans has a great take on what to do with quiet people who have no problem doing party work.
Yes.
Because it sounds Stalinist. Like, what Ceaușescu is doing in the Communist Party is kind of like what Stalin did. He takes on the, like, menial task, and, like, he winds up in charge because nobody thinks he's a threat.
Yeah. So basically, in the last days of George Day's sort of dictatorship, he's ailing, he's falling ill, he's kind of secluded himself, a la Woodrow Wilson after a massive stroke, and lets Edith do everything for him. Again, we're throwing as many references as we can in this episode.
By the way, let's call forward to something you and I have discussed is coming. Maybe other American presidents who may not be all there.
Yes. So Ceaușescu at this point is kind of in the inner circle.
Everybody, please pause the episode right now, get on Discord, and tell us who you think we're talking about.
Yeah. So Ceaușescu in our timeline is kind of the man behind the scenes. He's kind of like the chief of staff-esque figure, where he controls access to the dictator, George Day. And so he kind of realizes this and maneuvers the other guys who all are kind of vying for the throne, but and none of them are particularly influential enough to just outright be the guy. They have to be nominated by the ailing dictator. And Ceaușescu limits their access to where none of them can really get to him. Everything's fine. Oh, I'll be back before you know it. So George Day never nominates formally a successor. And then there's an actual power vacuum, and everybody kind of has to settle on Ceaușescu as a compromise candidate, because they're like, well, I don't like that guy. This guy's fine, so I guess we'll take him, because I definitely don't want the other guy. And so that's how Ceaușescu takes power. And then
By the way, sounds a little bit like our Lincoln episodes, doesn't it?
Yeah, kind of, sort of. It's very Lincoln-esque move. And Ceaușescu...
That is the only time, by the way, we will ever be comparing Abraham Lincoln to Nicolae Ceaușescu. You just want that on the record.
Although we don't know whether Lincoln joined the Republican Party because all the pretty girls were in it. So I don't want to, the record is unclear. But anyway, so Ceaușescu then basically becomes one of the more successful Eastern Bloc dictators. Because if you look at most of the rest of the Eastern Bloc, there's at least some attempt at an overthrow, at an assassination, what have you.
Or also just in terms of, it's a little unusual if you look at, like, call it 48-ish, kind of the Czechoslovakian slow coup, between 40 years, 48 to 88. How stable Romania was, because most of the other Warsaw Pact nations had not just natural death, but and we'll get into this a little bit. Like we sat down and named every member of the Warsaw Pact. Every single one of them had a anti-Soviet moment where they got knocked back in line.
Yeah.
Except for Romania. So both George Uday and Ceausescu were successful in keeping the Soviet Union out of their business, and while at the same time not being complete toadies. And I think Ceausescu, and you're about to get into like some of the way that Ceausescu was able to have a little bit of free reign.
Yeah, and so Ceausescu, he's kind of Tito-esque in the sense that he's kind of this iconoclast. He doesn't toe the Soviet party line. In '68, in the Czechoslovak uprising, he is. This is really what kind of starts his sort of Ceausescu-ness, for lack of a better word, is he denounces the Warsaw Pact invasion.
Ceausescusm? I mean, we have Holshism, we have Titoism. We could have
Ceausescosity. Don't ask me about the spelling, though. But Ceausescu denounces the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. He kind of becomes this darling of the Western powers in the Soviet bloc. That gets him a meeting with de Gaulle. That gets him a meeting with Nixon. He becomes kind of this guy in terms of communist leaders that the Western world can deal with. In the 70s, he starts doing all kinds of these programs, like Romania kind of hits a little bit of an economic improvement. The oil embargo kicks in the mid-70s, and Ceausescu decides that, hey, I'm going to, try and do a bunch of outreach with all this money that Romania has, because Romania is kind of a pretty decent oil-producing country in terms of the European sphere.
I mean, well, before the North Sea kind of comes online, Romania, for our American listeners might have heard of Ploiesti.
Yeah.
Which was a major oil field. Actually, that was how Romania got on the Nazi side in World War II, is they were the only source of oil for Nazi Germany. And they were Romania, the kind of right-wing military dictatorship, was worried about the Soviet Union like coming in and taking it over. The Nazis assisted that government and were like, you're under our protection. We're going to protect these oil fields because you're the only place we can get oil for our Panthers and Air Force and everything. So Romania is very important for European oil.
Yeah. And so Ceausescu kind of knows this. And so he takes advantage, he tries to take advantage of the kind of oil boom of the 1970s. But he does it kind of in a backwards way. He takes all the money that Romania is already making, and he spends it, to quote the Knight Templar from the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, poorly. In terms of he uses that money on a lot of foreign diplomatic overtures to third world countries, a bunch of stuff. And then because he's like, wait, I still want to make us an oil country, but I've already spent all the money we have. I'm going to borrow a bunch of money from the West. He never quite gets the oil thing off the ground with all this borrowed money. And so as a result, the kind of boom of the 70s is met by this kind of, those of you who pretty much everybody remembers the early days of after the '08 crisis in Europe, a lot of these austerity measures. That's kind of what Romania does in the 80s. And it's kind of remarkable because Ceausescu manages to not only repay, but prepay all of this foreign debt that Romania has in the 1980s. Like, it's kind of not an economic prosperity miracle, but an economic, like, accounting miracle, because he basically clears Romania's foreign debt except for, like, literally, I think it's like $1 million by 1989. Like, they're just completely in the clear. And then 1989, Ceausescu, unfortunately, he's gotten kind of old. He's gotten a little out of touch, doesn't realize that there's some unrest kind of simmering. He goes to Iran on a diplomatic mission, leaves cracking down on some unrest to his wife, which is a whole nother story. I fully encourage you to listen to Robert Evans' episodes on, because I don't want to, she's not really relevant to this episode, but the woman had like 16 honorary doctorates with a like elementary school education and was in charge of the entire scientific apparatus of Romania. It's wild.
To get back, and this is going to explain the episode art. I've already decided what it's going to be. Dylan, don't ask questions, just go with it. He chose poorly. When you join the Communist Party to increase your dating potential, you should choose better than somebody who, like, not this, who has an elementary school education and thinks they're a chemist.
Yeah.
He chose poorly.
Like, people, to give you, I won't, this is the last I will say of Elena Ceaușescu. When she was the director of the National Science Program with 16 honorary doctorates and an elementary school education, her nickname from the other scientists, was Codoi, which is a play on the Romanian way to say CO2, and also behind her back means she has a big butt.
Except, again, that's how she would pronounce it, because she didn't understand enough chemistry to know what
CO2.
Yes.
She literally thought it was Kutu. So anyway, that's our timeline. The real point of divergence starts.
The other thing I need to talk about is the palace.
Oh, God, yeah, the palace. I kind of ignored the architecture side of this, but go for it.
But I just, this needs to be talked about because, well, two things. One, he wants to create like an industrial powerhouse, even though he has this thing that is literally called black gold, rather than focusing on the thing literally called black gold.
Yeah.
He wants to build a bunch of factories, and then he also starts building this massive Hall of the People in downtown Bucharest. Knocks down multiple city blocks, and I do kind of want to do the math on like how many people could actually be in.
It was thousands.
It was thousands, and I realized like, hey, being the only power in the country for like 40 years will change your membership rolls, but several thousand people for a party that had 700 members.
Yeah, it's just absolutely wild. So that's kind of what we're missing out on without Ceaușescu. And the real point of divergence comes with George Uday's death in 64, 65. I forget the exact year. But the real question is, okay, if Ceaușescu's not in the picture, who takes over? And there's really two main choices. One is George Apostol, who is kind of the more Soviet-esque, like he's more friendly to the Soviets, at least by all inclination. It's hard to know with these guys because they aren't Ceaușescu. But he's kind of the more Stalinist, Soviet-friendly, more likely to toe the Comintern line. Or Jan George Maurer, who in our timeline is kind of the guy who helps rally everybody around Ceaușescu as a compromise candidate, because Ceaușescu's there and he knows Apostol shouldn't get the job. In this timeline, we're going to say without Ceaușescu, Maurer tries to rally those same forces around himself and becomes the new guy. Now, Maurer is kind of interesting because he's not Ceaușescu, but he does have some of those kind of semi-iconoclast tendencies. Like, he's not completely willing to toe the party line in terms of what the Soviets dictate. He does have some kind of independent streak to him. He's got a tendency towards at least some liberalization when he can kind of do it, even though he obviously recognizes you got to keep it under control. So we're going to say Maurer takes over in 65, and still nothing really changes other than in 68, what's called the Prague Spring kind of comes up. And this is, like I said, this is where Ceaușescu becomes kind of Ceaușescu, the golden boy of the West, because he denounces what amounts to basically the Czech Republic was trying to kind of de-Sovietize their communist government. They were going to kind of open up to some possible multi-party elections. It's all going to be kind of leftist, but there's some multi-party elections. They're going to go away from a lot of the restrictions that the Soviets mandated that they do on their state. And as a response, the Soviets are like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. And they call basically the Soviets and, call in all their buddies and they go invade, except Romania and Yugoslavia. Well, in this timeline, we're going to say, Chris, you think he joins the Prague Spring?
I think
at least kind of tokenly.
Well, I mean, I think what you and I talked about was, does the Prague, like, if
I don't think it changes either way.
Right. Like the Prague Spring gets crushed.
Yeah.
Like white and so maybe it gets crushed a little bit sooner, but not a whole lot changes on that front.
Yeah.
Except for maybe more taking a different tack with the Soviet Union, kind of a more subservient, a more toe the line pact.
Yeah, and Romania may be, because you don't have Ceaușescu making this big defiant stand, they don't quite become the sort of Eastern Bloc golden boy of the West. They already have some conversations with the French, so there's still at least a little bit more diplomatic channels to the West than a lot of the Soviet bloc, but they're not held up as this kind of, oh, this is a communist we can work with. This is a communist we can deal with in terms of like meeting with de Gaulle and Nixon and all that. So even after that, still not a whole lot of change until we get to kind of the oil embargo of the mid 70s. And that's where things, I think, start to get really interesting. And basically the oil crisis is OPEC, the oil petroleum exporting countries, basically cartel.
Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries.
Thank you. Sorry. I always get the acronym wrong. I'm a lawyer. I love acronyms. I can just never get them right. They basically decide to embargo oil. Like people in the US in the 70s, remember, this is all the lines to get to the gas station, all that. This is kind of the beginning of Romania's like, oh, this is our time to shine, because like Chris said, they're one of the Eastern European countries that has the advantage of, oh, we have oil. And so in Ceaușescu's timeline, he decides he's going to try and, the idea is, at least, he's not really great at doing it, he wants to build up Romania as kind of an oil refinery hub of Europe. And so that, I think, is our first interesting point of departure. And Chris, kind of what are your thoughts on sort of, just because I've been talking for a lot,
Sure.
What are your thoughts on sort of how this kind of starts to diverge?
So I think the biggest thing here is that, again, they have this resource, they just actually use it intelligently. Like, rather than taking whatever hard currency, because that's kind of the biggest thing for any Eastern Bloc country, especially after the oil shocks, is getting access to what's called hard currency, a convertible currency, basically pieces of paper that you can buy things from the West with.
Yeah.
And what our Ceaușescu does is squanders that on building factories for things that nobody needs,
like TVs and stuff. Yeah,
TVs. I'm sorry. Yes, they talked about TVs. I have to talk about the IKEA bookcases.
Sorry, Sweden, in advance.
You know what? Sweden wasn't NATO yet, so I don't know what that does to anything. But like, he basically takes all of this capital, all of this money he makes from the increased oil revenue, and spends it to build factories that don't produce anything, but they do consume so much energy that you have rolling blackouts. You have like days on which it is illegal to heat your home. And Romania, again, the oil exporter of Europe, becomes a net energy importer because of his policies. If you don't do that, Romania is in a really really good position to be up. Like maybe East Germany was the one kind of Warsaw Pact power that, for the lack of a better phrase, economically pulled its own, came close to pulling its
it
own.
stood on its own two legs.
And the fact that Ceausescu took a natural gift and just flushed it down a golden toilet.
Yeah.
And if he, what we're postulating here is a mortar doesn't, and sets Romania up as one of the almost a shining example within the Warsaw Pact of politically subservient to Moscow, but also not an economic drain on Moscow. Actually, a net contributor to the Warsaw Pact, like economic circle, which is going to come into play later.
But also, and subservient to Moscow, but with enough of an independent streak. Like I said about Tito, Moscow's not going to try and assassinate them, but Moscow's going to know they can't completely go willy-nilly with just handing orders out left and right. Like, one, because of the economic situation, but also because Romania is going to have this kind of special diplomatic place. Moscow's going to know they have to kind of tread lightly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to get really interesting once you get into the mid 1980s. So I realize we're doing a lot of time jumps here, but that's because there's a lot of kind of micro stuff that takes a while to start cooking.
We picked a random European dictator and we're like, let's see if we can make something interesting of this. We did. Let us cook. I do want to jump to kind of our timeline again and talk about like Brezhnev of Soviet Union is the leader and everybody answers to them. Like this is that we did an earlier episode about the military dictatorship in Poland where like Poland kind of overthrew itself to stop the Soviets from invading.
Yeah.
This was under Brezhnev. Brezhnev was very much like
I wear the highway.
And also he was very much into the almost throwback to Stalinist, like heavy industry, military industrial complex, building a whole bunch of iron and steel and tanks. And what that kind of led to was the 1980s and the Pong Gap, where the United States kind of had this huge advantage in computers and electronics. And one of the things the Soviet Union started trying to do was import that stuff using, that hard currency I just talked about. Because to a large extent, the Soviet and the Eastern Bloc economy had kind of stagnated by this point. And so it needed exports to revitalize. And then we have this situation where a export-oriented Romania can really become a central player in the Warsaw Pact, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think with a Romania that has this much kind of liquid currency coming in. Sorry. And, this kind of special place, that puts it in a really interesting position. One, vis-a-vis kind of Poland with all that we talked about with the Wojciech episode, but also with, after Brezhnev, you've got kind of this quick succession of like, one or two or three guys that kind of just don't matter.
Here's what I always love to tell the story of at Chernenko. So it was when Brezhnev died, the Soviet Union appointed Chernenko as the successor.
I think.
Huh?
Andropov and then Chernenko.
Andropov. Andropov first. When Brezhnev died and they appointed Andropov, for whatever reason, Reagan did not go to the funeral. George H.W. Bush did. And he is supposed to have commented to somebody who, another dignitary there, once Andropov was the successor. H.W. Bush is supposed to have commented at the funeral, "I'll see you next year." with the understanding.
The irony is basically next time, literally, Andropov died and Chernenko came in.
It'd be because everybody was like, these are all people who danced for Stalin. These are all people who personally knew him and had gone through like all these. They were young. These were the kind of people that Stalin had put in power over the older Bolsheviks. These were all people in like their 20s, and back then they owed their careers to Stalin. They were commissars during the war. They all knew each other. And at a certain point, generational leadership runs out. You just if you just look at the math, if you were in your 30s during World War II, you're very old by the 1980s.
You're in your late 60s, 70s, 80s. And that leads to Gorbachev taking over because you have Andropov, you have Chernenko. Neither one survives more than like a year and a half. And then Gorbachev comes in and he's kind of looking at the Soviet Union saying, hey, this needs to kind of be restructured if it's going to have any chance at surviving. And so that gets to things like glasnost and perestroika in terms of a political opening and economic restructuring of the sort of Soviet economic system, not just in the Soviet Union, but also in the wider Warsaw Pact.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gets really interesting because if you have a Romania with both liquid and paper currency flowing in, that kind of helps keep this whole thing propped up because they provide a vital lifeline to what a lot of the rest of the Soviet Union can't access in terms of hard cash, tradable currencies, stuff to acquire stuff with. Mm-hmm. That presents a really interesting idea in terms of especially perestroika more than glasnost, because glasnost is the political one. Perestroika is the economic restructuring. That presents really interesting opportunities as the 80s go on.
There's something to be said for 56. 1956 was the year that Khrushchev gave his de-Stalinization speech. And other than the Suez Crisis, which we just did an episode on, I literally have like written down every episode we've done, and I'm trying to hit every one of them. You have the Hungarian Revolt of 1956. In 68, this is just after Brezhnev has come into power after overthrowing Khrushchev. Basically, what you see in Eastern Europe every single time there is a change in Soviet leadership, all of these satellites are looking at the Soviet Union, at the person in charge of the Soviet Union. And since so much of the actual experience of being a Soviet satellite depends upon what this individual person does, when that person changes, it's a big question in all of these countries. What can we get away with? So like kind of the Prague Spring in 68 is, well, Khrushchev talked about confronting the West and had a kind of a more dynamic sense, but nobody knows what Brezhnev's take on this is.
And that gets us to 1987, which is, in our history, a very fundamental, important year, but in this timeline, going to be an even more fundamental, important year. 1987 is kind of when Gorbachev begins. He's been in power for, I think, 2, maybe 3 years.
I think he was 85. So it's 2-ish.
So he's consolidated power. He's kind of gotten himself settled.
And also, again, like this is generational change. This isn't like the United States where, hey, noon, January 20th. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
this
It's
is the
much
person in
more
charge.
kind of vague,
Yeah.
settlement based. Like there's a consolidation of power. Gorbachev we're talking January, February of 1987, is introducing glasnost and perestroika, which are these political and economic reexaminations of the entire structure kind of the Soviet Union, especially perestroika, which is the revision of the sort of top down state economic planning. He's like, hey, this isn't entirely working. We need to revise this, maybe look at some opening up, some expansion, some flexibility in the planning. Well, there's another interesting thing that happens in 1987, specifically on March 2nd, all the way on the other side of the globe in Washington, D.C.
I guess at the other end of the red line. Can we say that?
Yeah, the other end of the red line. March 2nd, 1987, the Gipper, the great communicator, is in office. And his chief of staff, Howard Baker, sends a memo that says, hey, I want all of you, meaning White House staff, whoever he's got meetings with that day, to be on the lookout for signs of Reagan's condition. Because at this point, Reagan's, 76, 77, 78, something like that? Like he's elderly.
It also, like, I don't think we've ever done an episode on Iran-Contra. I think we might need to.
Yeah.
But, like, it is seriously suggested, kind of his defense against what happened in Iran-Contra was, I don't remember what happened.
Yeah.
He threaded this very thin needle of saying, you know, either you knew what happened and should be impeached, or you did not know what your own government was doing, weren't awake in the meetings, and should probably have been removed.
Yeah. And so
Pick one. And nobody pinned him down and made him pick one.
exactly. And so Howard Baker is the closest anybody ever came to actually pinning this down. This March 2nd memo says, hey, everybody watch Reagan today and keep an eye on him, see how he reacts, see how he handles things. If he seems like he's not all there, we need to invoke the 25th Amendment, which, for those of you who haven't listened to any of our episodes where presidents have died, is the Presidential Succession Amendment to the Constitution.
Well, it's actually in place. It wasn't in place for some of our earlier episodes.
Yeah, but we've always talked about it. Yeah. But so there's a sincere question as to whether Reagan, like in our timeline, Reagan just kind of magically, according to reports, happened to be super extra the Gipper that day. Like he was on it, he was ready for everything, and everybody basically said,
I mean, we all
this
know
is fine, he's chill.
We all know what happened. It was the 80s. They gave him Coke-laced black jelly beans. We know
that's
okay?
So
like
basically,
we don't know it, but we all know this.
Yeah, we all know this. So in this timeline, we're going to suggest Howard Baker's memo still goes out, but for whatever reason, whether it's there's no cocaine in the black jelly beans or whatever, he doesn't watch his favorite Western that morning, whatever. The Gipper is not on it that day. And so in March of 1987, the 25th Amendment is invoked. And so,
so we actually had a question about this.
Yeah.
What we thought about was, instead of it being invoked there. So I'm going to pause and I think I can get this done relatively quickly. I hope you don't mind. In the middle of Watergate, in October 1973, basically, this makes sense. Promise. We might need to start releasing video just of Dylan's face. Nixon is kind of like what was probably going on with Reagan in 87. Nixon is under Watergate investigation, and people are like worried about his well-being. In the Middle East, there's the Yom Kippur War. At one point, the Soviet Union basically told the United States, if you don't rein in the Israelis, we will deploy troops to Egypt to stop them. The United States went on a heightened military alert. The man that ordered that was Henry Kissinger, not Richard Nixon, because they didn't want to bring it to him because he was too worried about Watergate. And what we were suggesting is, if you have kind of a earlier crisis where, like I said, Hungary and Poland, like, it's crazy how often Poland does this.
Yeah,
Other countries get the
like
credit.
every 5 years.
But Poland too starts to test Khrushchev, and Czechoslovakia test Brezhnev. In our timeline, by the way, like, East Germany went to Gorbachev and was like, hey, how far can we go? And Gorbachev kind of said, you're on your own. Like, I will not do anything to you. In our timeline, 87, a resurgent, independent, or financially independent Romania basically looks at the Soviet Union and says, you're a net drain on our finances.
Now that you're talking about perestroika, let's go ahead and explore this.
And what Dylan and I talked about was the fact that it was Berlin in 89, plus Czechoslovakia, plus solidarity, plus everything else. Plus, like, for an old Polish friend of mine, like, for some reason, the 70-year-old Pope John Paul II showing up in Berlin with a sledgehammer and personally, like he takes an incense ball and starts swinging that.
He's gonna warhammer that.
Sure, whatever. Okay. Instead of that happening, and by the way, and this is the critical thing, a lot of you are sitting there being like, well, that's 2 years. So what? 2 years. 2 years can be really important because in 89, it was George H.W. Bush making these decisions. Let me say this. A man who was a former UN ambassador, was a former CIA director, was a former U.S. ambassador to China, I believe. Like, the man had more foreign policy chops than possibly any vice president.
Since, like, John Quincy Adams, maybe.
Maybe an Eisenhower because he had personal relationships with. But Reagan doesn't have that. And in the Reagan White House, you have this other group. You have the, like, experienced people who, by the way, like, echoes of this to this day. One of the things that Putin claims is there were American promises way back in the 80s that we will not expand NATO. We will, respect kind of a Russian sphere of influence, which actually stopped the collapse of the Soviet Union from going hot and bad.
Yeah.
And if you have so basically, if you have a resurgent Romania trying to break free, and H.W. Bush is going to take kind of the same tact that Eisenhower did in 56, which is, listen, like, freedom, democracy, everything's wonderful. We're not really going to push this and upset the Soviet Union. Like, if they're okay with it, whatever, we will come to some agreement with them. But we're not going to reach into the Soviet sphere and fuck with it.
Yeah.
There are people in the Reagan White House, close to Reagan, who might have a different feeling about that.
Yeah, so you're basically setting up a rather than Howard Baker outright getting the approval for the 25th Amendment, you're essentially setting up like a Game of Thrones type internal kind of power play where it's the HW faction who's like, all right, get the Gipper out of here versus the Ronald Reaganites.
Right. The people who are like, yeah, I'm not going to say that Nancy Reagan's astrologist is actually like the director.
Another throwback to a Behind the Bastards episode.
It is like an actual like cabinet member, but like you have those kind of, I'm going to say neocons.
Yeah.
By the way, the kind of people who like to kind of use Iraq as a microcosm of like what we're talking about here. In 91, H.W. Bush was like, we are going to liberate Kuwait, and we are not going to roll back the foreign enemy. We're not going to overthrow Saddam. And he got criticism for it. The same people that in 2003 were like, you know what? That is unfinished business. We need to go in there and solve that problem. They were all throughout the Reagan administration. They were the secretaries of 2003 were deputies and undersecretaries.
Rumsfeld and all those guys. Yeah.
And so they take the tact of let's threaten, let's muscularly push them back and confront them. And that gets real interesting.
Yeah. Well, and ironically, either way for Bush, it's a win-win because either he becomes the president or he becomes the president. It's just a question of, is it the 25th Amendment or an election?
Well,
for him, either way, he can take over under the 25th.
I'm not willing to say that.
Okay.
I think if he let's be honest, there is a real possibility if he loses the 25th Amendment fight and the United States confronts.
Well, depending on how internal it stays, I guess, because George Bush is also former CIA director.
Correct.
He's smart enough to make sure that if he's going to make his play.
Oh no. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it's not necessarily him, but if the Rumsfeld people win, I think he was a private citizen visiting Saddam by this point. But if that faction wins, you're right that it won't come out that Bush tried to invoke the 25th Amendment. But what will happen if they do confront Romania, if they do confront the Soviet Union in Romania, I want to remind you of the August coup in 91 in the Soviet Union. Like, this gets real spicy. This is a spicy goulash. That might be Hungarian. Yeah. Don't come at me.
Yeah, it is.
I know it is. But like, is there a Washington to have an inauguration in? Like, does it get hot? It could get hot. Like, you understand exactly what I'm saying. If he loses.
So I guess that's the fork of the fork in time is, depending on what happens with Reagan, we either have, just to kind of wrap things to a close and kind of get us up, depending on this Reagan question, we either have kind of,
and by the way,
a hot,
I'm not saying it's a binary choice. I'm not saying
no. But
if we confront the Soviets,
these are the things that we're looking at.
Yeah,
we either have something
that Overton window. It's somewhere between these things, and there are options.
We're either on the one end we're looking at the extreme of this may be finally after 50 years when the Cold War gets hot, depending on how drastic things get, or if things are maneuvered the right way. An oil field rich Romania may crack the Soviet Union before 90, 91 in our timeline. And, just a couple years early, help at least not necessarily take down the Soviet Union, but widen the cracks enough to where it's recognized that it's inevitable that it will fall.
And the other thing I think it might be interesting is if the nature of the cracks are mercantile economics.
Yes, because
kind of a people power.
Exactly. Yeah, because I think that gets to an economic versus political question, because I think then you start, and this is where it gets hard to predict the knock-on effects, because once you can bifurcate into purely economic versus political, because in our timeline they were always kind of tied together.
Mm-hmm.
But once you have a kind of communist Romania with an economy that's independent enough to be able to crack the sort of Soviet economic dominance, but not political dominance, there becomes this question of, okay, and this is going to skirt dangerously close to our fork in time avoidance of politics, but I'll go there because I know we're kind of wrapping to a close. I wonder if the economic cracking of the Soviet Union doesn't help or possibly help leftist kind of political governments, not economic governments. So, labor parties, socialist parties, as opposed to state-managed economic models.
I do think it's really important for what happens with privatization.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of where I'm going. Yeah. I think the privatization question versus the collectivization question stays more of a purely economic question rather than a political and economic. They're intrinsically linked. You can't separate them, et cetera, et cetera. So you may see something about basically Eastern Europe, assuming the Soviets eventually do fall. You may see this kind of weird mishmash where you may have right-leaning governments that have sort of state-planned economic models where the state's much more involved, and left-leaning models where they're much more capitalist-friendly. Like, that kind of patchwork is very interesting to think of, especially as you get to like the Clinton 90s and the 2000s, in terms of how that can change the kind of tapestry of Europe.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the push in our time is for like European unity, but I think in Romania, who has this lived self-image of being kind of the way Germany thinks of itself today in Europe, as like we're the powerhouse, or we lose money by being a member of this organization. I think that really changes the way the EU is viewed in definitely Romania, and maybe some of these other kind of privatized, these post-Soviet economies.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of beyond the gambit of this episode to imagine sort of what that might look like. But I think it is really interesting to see sort of what, like, I have some kind of wild ideas as to what kind of possibilities that could emerge with. Like, Europe may not be the kind of sort of unified front that it kind of presents in today if we have that kind of scenario.
Right.
So this was kind of an interesting episode for as much skipping as we did in terms of from where we started to where the meat of it was.
When you do an episode that has a time span of 60 years, stuff's going to happen.
Yeah. So I think this was really kind of an interesting result that we had. It does remind me of our Wojciech kind of episode.
Yeah.
But before we sign off, Chris, do you have any final thoughts? Anything that you want to get out there?
Not really, no.
Okay, I think we, for once, managed to wrap this one up in a relatively tidy bow. So with that, I will only say, as we always do here on A Fork in Time, if you should happen to come across a fork in time, what should you do?
build a multi-block palace in the middle of the road.
I'll take it.
Take it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.